Hey folks, my name is Darren Lapomi. I am a professor of nanoengineering and chemical engineering and materials science at UC San Diego. I am also the Associate Dean for Students in Engineering. I have a PhD in chemistry and a postdoc in chemical engineering. I am not in the same field as Jennifer Doudna, but we have interacted with apparently a lot of the same people separated by a couple of degrees, and I thought it would be fun to kind of take a look at the book Codebreaker by Walter Isaacson, whose subtitle is Jennifer Doudna, Gene Editing and the Future of the Human Race, and talk about not do like a conventional book review, but more of what it gets right and wrong about the way scientific research is done, especially at a university setting. So before we get started, there are a number of glossary terms that people who have not been steeped in academic science might not be aware of. So here is a quick rundown. So the types of people that work in labs fall into a few different categories. So you have undergrads who are generally going to be volunteers in a lab. You have transfer undergraduates. So those are students who did a 2-year associate's degree at a community college and then come into a nominally 4-year institution. Then you have students who start out at nominally 4-year institutions. I say nominally because especially in big public institutions like UC San Diego, it's not uncommon for students to spend a total of, say, 5 to 6 years getting their undergraduate degrees, especially if they are coming in as transfer students because of the way that prereqs work and so on. Anyway, garden path. Okay, then you have graduate students. So you have MS students and PhD students. Most students in the natural sciences, so that is students in biology, chemistry, and physics, do not apply for terminal MS degrees. They apply for the PhD degree, and then they get the MS degree on the way. In engineering, it works differently, where an MS degree is something that you apply directly to, and it is, you get a pay premium for having the MS degree and so forth. But on the natural sciences side, an MS degree is kind of something that someone might raise an eyebrow and say, did you stop getting the PhD? Because they might not understand. I'm not making any value judgment here. It's just the way that it happens sometimes. Okay, so in the book, Isaacson mentioned that Jennifer Doudna, when she started out as a student in Harvard Medical School, did lab rotations before she finally settled on Jack Szostak's group. And what is a rotation? A rotation is when a grad student comes in. Before they decide on the lab they're going to do their thesis research in, they spend the first either 3 to 6 months rotating from lab to lab, usually 3 labs. And Isaacson describes it as the purpose of these rotations as to learn new techniques. I would say that's not generally the purpose for the rotation. Really, it's to see if the fit between the graduate student and the PI, who is the professor, the advisor, professor, PI, all kind of mean the same thing in this context, to see if that fit is good. Okay, then after PhD students, you have postdocs. A postdoc is almost like an academic resident. So a postdoc is usually somebody who wants to pursue a career in academia or industrial R&D, but wants a few more years of additional training on top of the PhD. And in a postdoc, you typically do that in a different institution from which you did your PhD. And what happens is that the postdoc advisor, sometimes they have funding, sometimes the PhD student who's applying for a postdoc has to seek out that funding, and then ideally that person works in the lab of their postdoc advisor in a more independent way than they did as a graduate student, because after all, they have a PhD. Now, historically, a postdoc was something super special. Like, you got a postdoc fellowship in this famous person's lab, and you got to be kind of, you got the best of both worlds. You got to do whatever you want on somebody else's dime. Now, because of this academic arms race where people have to get more and more and more and more training to get the same kinds of jobs as they did before, the postdoc is kind of like everybody has to do it, especially in the natural sciences like biology, chemistry, physics, where if you want to do something even close to R&D, either academically or industrially, you pretty much have to do a postdoc. In engineering, it's not quite that way, although it's getting that way in the more bio-oriented fields like biology, some areas of chemical engineering. It is less the case in electrical engineering and computer science. Material science, you generally need a postdoc. Mechanical engineering, somewhere in between. Okay, so that's a postdoc. So you'll remember that Jennifer Doudna did her PhD work with Jack Szostak at Harvard, and did her postdoc with Tom Cech at University of Colorado at Boulder. Okay, after postdoc, you have something that is a type of researcher who is not yet a professor, but more than a postdoc. So they are like employees, like full-time employees. Sometimes they have the title staff scientist or research assistant professor or something like that. These positions are sometimes known as Permadoc positions. So the term is meant to be funny as a pejorative. It's kind of tragic, in my opinion, where this academic arms race makes people getting more and more and more overtrained. And then it looks like, well, they can't call you a postdoc anymore because it violates university rules to have postdocs for more than 5 years. So you get another title, and sometimes that title is called a permadoc. Again, pejoratively. All right, next up you have staff scientist, Next up you have the professors. So the professors, these are tenure track people who do a combination of teaching and research and service. So they do maybe research 60% of the time, teaching 30% of the time, and service 10% of the time. And for someone like me who's gone into administration, the service role is expanded. The teaching role is reduced. The research hopefully is about the same, but probably honestly going to end up being a little reduced as well. So professors have 3 different levels: assistant professor, which at most places is untenured, associate professor. So between assistant and associate professor, you get tenure in most systems, not Harvard and MIT, but they're outliers for a lot of different reasons. At Harvard and MIT, you're not tenured until you get full professor, or just full professor, or just professor. So in some places like the University of California system, full professor itself has different levels, and as my friend Charles Dong at the University of Delaware said, there are different levels of fullness for a professor. So anyway, after you get full professor, you get sometimes university professor or an endowed chair or something, and then maybe your university has like distinguished professor, university professor, something like that. And then when you retire and you keep your office, it's called an emeritus professor. Okay, and then the level beyond that, and we've seen a lot of these people in Codebreaker, is a Nobel laureate. Just kidding, they're not any kind of special category, although they might think that they're some kind of special category. So Jack Szostak won the Nobel Prize. This is Jennifer Doudna's PhD advisor in 2009, and her postdoc advisor, Tom Cech, won the Nobel Prize when he was quite young, actually, by the standards of the Nobel Prize in 1989, the year that Doudna started her PhD. Okay, so all right, so those are the people. That's the cast of characters, the types of titles that people that do academic research have. And what does an academic researcher do? Well, they go into the lab, usually, nominally for a grad student is working 40 hours a week, depending on how the university accounts for things. They might say 20 hours a week, they get paid for 20, but really they work 40 hours a week. But really, they work 50 or 60 hours a week. And this type of, and ideally, the people who do research are kind of self-selected to be like the kind of person who wants to be in the lab when they're not in the lab. They wish they were in the lab. They're always thinking about their research. They're kind of this type A personality that tends to be in academic research groups. Okay. Who pays for the research? So research is expensive. And we think about, when we watch a movie, we see these highfalutin labs with all of this equipment and shiny stuff and metal walls and a lot of glass. Really, comparatively, academic research labs are quite crappy. Often they haven't been renovated since 1985, and they're dusty, and there's a lot of acid stains on the bench tops, and the fume hoods are dirty and they make noise. And maybe less so in biological research, where you want everything to be, free of proteins and adventitious nucleic acids all over the place. So you bleach and ethanol, everything. But anyway, okay, so research is expensive, even if it's not being spent on the infrastructure. What is the most expensive part of the research enterprise? And that is the personnel. The same thing in any corporate structure, the people are the most expensive part. So let's say that a graduate student earns a stipend of about $30,000 to $35,000 a year, which is not very much, especially given the places where universities tend to be. Boston, the Bay Area, New York City, Los Angeles, San Diego, Austin, Texas, Denver, Colorado, these places tend to be quite expensive. So $35,000 is not a lot of money. In addition to the $35,000, you also have to pay, and I say you, meaning the professor, but ultimately the taxpayer, has to pay tuition remission. And tuition remission is a benefit paid to the student by the university in exchange for not having to pay the tuition out of grant money. So it's some kind of form of money laundering. So you can't charge tuition to a federal grant, but you can charge tuition remission, which is a way of kind of getting around that rule, which is a very poorly kept secret, but one that people generally turn a blind eye to. Okay, so that's another $20K, or up to $55K now. Then you have the benefits, so health insurance, another few K. Then you have the instrumentation usage. Sometimes you have equipment, you have publication and travel charges, and you have materials and supplies like pipette tips, petri dishes, ethanol, acetone, solvents, buffers, all kinds of stuff that's used in biomedical research. Then you're up to something like $70K in direct costs. But then the university charges approximately 50 to 60% of direct costs on top of that money as overhead or indirect costs, which pay for the air conditioner and the landscaping and the administrative staff, and that brings the total up to about $100K per year per student or postdoc. So research is really expensive, and most of that money comes from, in the US system, comes from tax payers through federal funding agencies, the largest of which, at least that funds academic research, is the National Institutes of Health, which has something around a $40 billion budget. Most of that goes to extramural research, which is spent outside of the NIH facility in Bethesda, Maryland, and then you have National Science Foundation, which is probably around like 10 billion. Then the Department of Energy, it's a little harder. I'm not sure I know the number for that. Then Department of Defense. And there are various different mechanisms for Defense Department to fund academic research. But for example, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research has a budget of about $500 million per year. So every 3 years, we apply for, or every year, maybe every couple months, we apply for a new grant. And then every few years, if we're lucky enough to get it, we'll apply for a renewal or a continued support in some function. Okay, now when Jack Szostak, who was Jennifer Doudna's PhD advisor, won the Nobel Prize in 2009, he won it with two other scientists for their work on substructures of chromosomes. So I think a function of telomeres. And somebody did the calculation that over the course of those three individuals' independent careers, they got a total of $32 million from the NIH in terms of grant funding. Now, that work has led to a lot of very important biomedical research, and some of that money actually went into training Jennifer Doudna, who, won her own Nobel Prize in 2020. Some of the other money comes from private organizations and companies. Biomedical research companies, a lot of labs in the physical sciences and engineering are funded by telecommunications companies as well as defense contractor companies. So that is money that was once tax money and then ends up back in publicly, or ends up in research, which is formally now privately funded. You can also have philanthropic donors. So whenever you see the name of a university building or a center that's called the so-and-so laboratory for integrated science and engineering and biomedicine or something, that some of that money goes toward research infrastructure. It's possible that some of it goes to endowed chairs. It's possible that some of it goes to other types of expense categories. A university research lab can also have individuals who come in with their own funding. So these are people students who won some competitive fellowship, either from the National Institutes of Health or the NSF or a private organization. All right. So what are some of the characteristics of a professor that were highlighted in the book? So Isaacson describes Jennifer Doudna as being tightly scheduled but always available. And what does that mean? So oftentimes a professor will be, their schedule will be scheduled for like maybe 5 to 8 hours a day or 3 to 8 hours a day, depending on the amount of service responsibility that person is doing. But in between meetings or when there are long stretches of no meetings, typically our doors will be open. And the reason we come to work, even though we barely work in the lab, if at all, is because we want our PhD students, undergraduates, and postdocs working in our lab to be able to ask us questions. And oftentimes we get lonely in here and really just want human company, even though we could probably spend most of our time working from home, as COVID has taught us that we can basically do most of our jobs from home, but that kind of lab community suffers. Okay, when Jennifer Doudna was attempted to change her major from chemistry to French. One of her advisors said something like, with a chemistry degree, you can do anything. With a French degree, you can teach French. I think that's a little bit not correct, but I think on either side of that issue, I think an engineering degree is probably a little bit more immediately hireable than a chemistry or a physics or a biology degree, and I say that having a chemistry degree myself, but we were also told that Doudna's interest in the humanities and her father, Martin Doudna's interest in the humanities and reading books and classics permitted her to have a more expansive humanistic view of the implications of the work that she was doing, that had a more, let's say, that had a moral valence to it. So what could have a greater moral valence than the idea that we can and possibly should be able to alter the gene line or the germ line in order to program desirable or at least exclude undesirable characteristics like fatal genetic diseases. Like if you could cure Huntington's disease just like that, it wouldn't be that easy. But what if you could? Should you? Or cystic fibrosis. These types of diseases or certain types of cancer that are very highly correlated to genetics. Should you be able to do that? And Jennifer Doudna believes that her training, her interest in the humanities allowed her to see a bigger perspective. Okay, so we were talking about whether or not professors worked in the lab. Honestly, I have not been in the lab for any significant amount of time in several weeks. I know that makes me probably a bad professor, but it is very much not uncommon. However, there is significant evidence that Doudna's mentors, Shostak and Czech, actually were in the lab a lot. So Jack Shostak, who I didn't really have any connection with, I went to a seminar with him when there was this Origin of Life initiative at Harvard, and he was in the audience. And my advisor, George Whitesides, gave a talk on the use of evaporating ponds as high salt dehydrating conditions for the formation of biomolecules or biopolymers in particular. And Jack Shostak said in the Q&A session, I'm finding your hypothesis a little vague. And then George said, I can't imagine it being any vaguer, which is also a vague response. And I tended to agree with Jack in that particular exchange. But that is my one memory of at least being in the same room with Jack Shostak. So anyway, and then Tom Czech. Tom Czech is somebody who he's very much available on YouTube. You can find these things. He contributed to this program called Making the Right Moves, which is a guidebook for new professors who come in and want to do good work. It's how to navigate university life as somebody who comes in into the work for the first time. And he had a YouTube video which was very influential on me as I started my career. And one of his quotes, I'm gonna quote from a quote that from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute website on the Making the Right Moves little booklet, more than little, a big booklet. He said, you should build a research group by being in the lab as much as possible. The assistant professors who don't get tenure are the ones who spend all of their time in the office instead of in the lab. Tenure means that after 4 to 6 years, you've done enough research where they basically can't fire you unless you do something really really bad. Yeah, so she came from an environment that made her very much accessible to her students. She didn't say specifically, Isaacson didn't say specifically how much time she spent in the lab, but you did get the impression that she spent a lot of time mentoring her students, and one tends to believe that, knowing what we do know about Professor Doudna from interviews and so on. All right. There are some other interesting vignettes in there about scientists' personalities. She recalled a story to Isaacson about walking by Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize for parts of, basically discovering parts of chromosomes and how chromosomes operate, and not saying anything. And this was at a conference. And I've had that same experience. Where you really desperately want to introduce yourself to this famous scientist, and probably they would love to talk to you, especially if you're at a conference or you work on the same campus. And I had this experience with Edward O. Wilson, who was a famous entomologist who wrote the book Sociobiology and the Diversity of Life, coined the word biodiversity, was an expert in ants, won multiple Pulitzer Prizes for his scientific writing. And one time I walked by E.O. Wilson on the sidewalk, and I said, "Hi, Professor Wilson," knowing that he was a little bit hard of hearing, and he didn't look up at all, and I'm sure it's because he couldn't hear me. So I don't know. I had the guts to do it, but I didn't get any satisfaction out of that particular interaction. There was a little bit of a kind of uncomfortable personal history that Isaacson relayed about the failure of Doudna's first marriage, which he, I don't know if he attributed it to the fact that the husband wasn't quite as ambitious as Jennifer Doudna, and that she wanted to work, late and couldn't think about anything but science, and he really was into other things. Okay, then there were two very important postdocs who ended up doing the foundational work in the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing system, and that those people are Blake Wiedenheft and Martin Yennick. And Blake Wiedenheft as a postdoc candidate, was described to not have very good letters. Now, that's interesting because, he helped to make some of the most important biomedical discoveries of the early 21st century. And what was described, so you kind of see this a lot. This is a repeating theme in hiring academic people, where a kind of an unusual personality type who spends all of their time, their free time, collecting biological samples, for example, in Dr. Wiedenheft's native Montana, and doing field experimentation kind of independently as a teenager and as a child, maybe in their PhD work, they didn't get the right project. Maybe they got a bad advisor, the advisor is kind of like a negligent advisor. And as a result, they didn't publish a lot of papers and maybe didn't get great letters, even though they have it in them to be a very powerful researcher. And Dr. Wiedenheft, the postdoc, ended up, joining Professor Doudna's lab and ended up being amazing. So then you had Martin Yennick, who is an international postdoc from Central Europe, I believe, what is now what was then Czechoslovakia. And one thing that is not always appreciated is just how important international students and postdocs are to the research enterprise in the United States. So I think in some cases, this actually, the fact that this isn't well known serves our community well, because I think if this were used as a political football, it would be a very bad thing. So at given institutions, you might have grad student populations be 50% international, and the postdocs might be more than 50% international. So from Europe and Asia, we have a lot of fantastic grad students and postdocs. And so another well-kept but open secret in academia is that they're paid by, for the most part, university research grants, which are paid for by the American taxpayers. And a lot of those individuals will stay in the US, but a lot of them won't. So I'm totally okay with that. I'm totally for scientific educational diplomacy. You know, if you zoom out and look at the United States, what are our best exports? Commercial aircraft and university education and corn and soybeans. So if you look at some of our best exports, you know, we do a lot of diplomacy. Like, look at all of the people in engineering firms and in positions of leadership at companies in other countries often did their training in the U.S. So I think it's important to keep in mind, but also kind of a good thing that it's not that politically it's kind of under the radar. All right. Okay, a little bit about Professor Doudna's management style. So I mentioned that Isaacson characterized her as being tightly scheduled, but also available. Also, she had a hiring style of wanting input from current members so that they would be comfortable with the new hires. So rather than her just kind of grilling the candidate about what they did as an undergraduate or in their research lab or as a graduate student, if she's hiring postdocs, she wanted them to really spend a day with the research lab and get an idea of how things would go. There have been cases where I have been totally sold on a candidate, and then they interact with the lab, and the lab members come back to me the next day and said, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think you want to hire this person. And then we drop it. I think it's academic research is a little bit like, I mean, it's unusual in its in that it's not one task that you're hiring the person for. You're hiring them to be part of a collaborative team. You're hiring them to think independently, to do a lot of writing, to come to you with ideas, and this goes along with Doudna's her other characteristic that when it comes to group management and hiring is that Isaacson said that she wanted to work with people who are independent and came to her for advice, but not necessarily day-to-day guidance, and I would say not even week-to-week guidance. She also has a big lab. A lot of grad students and postdocs want to do their research in her group. She's very well funded. So maybe, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's between 20 and 40, I'm sure, of people affiliated with the lab. And the question is, you know, can you give your best to everyone? Or do you count on interactions of people within the lab to do the education and training of the younger generation? Okay. So Isaacson has biographized many different innovators. So he has books on Einstein and Steve Jobs and Benjamin Franklin. Interestingly, Jennifer Doudna is one of the few women that he's profiled. I believe the first woman that he did a whole book about, although The Innovators has a long section on Ada Lovelace, for example. But anyway, discussion for another time. But he likes to wax a little bit about the nature of scientific innovation and technological progress. And this is true in this book, in The Codebreaker, as well. So he describes CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing as being at odds with the linear model of science. And what is the linear model of science? So the linear model of science was described by Vannevar Bush, who was the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which was the precursor to the National Science Foundation, but it was active during World War II. So Bush had a role in the Manhattan Project as an administrator, and was also an accomplished scientist himself. And he wrote a famous pamphlet, he wrote a famous brief to President Truman at the end of World War II that said, it was called the Endless Frontier, Science, the Endless Frontier, that basically said that fundamental discovery-oriented science leads to technologies, and that the directionality is always in that way. So you always have basic science, curiosity, you know, that poster you see in 5th grade on the wall of your classroom that says observation, hypothesis, gathering of data, testing the hypothesis, reevaluating the hypothesis in the face of data, and then going back to observation, and so on. And you keep repeating this until you get closer and closer to the truth, or exclude more and more competing hypotheses for what's happening. Okay, and Isaacson, so he challenges that the notion that CRISPR is an example of the linear model. So if you look at the earliest bits of evidence that this could be used as a gene editing tool, you had Francisco Mojica in Alicante, Spain, who first discovered the CRISPR system. You notice in bacteria that he hypothesized, but didn't really have the proof yet that it was that it evolved as a viral defense mechanism, so a defense mechanism against viruses. And then you had, so that is kind of basic science, and then Doudna and Fang Zhang and others found out how it worked, and then Doudna is really credited for exploiting how it works into, or Doudna and Charpentier are credited with transforming it from a discovery to a technology, like using it as gene editing. And okay, you can kind of see that follows some linear progression, but then he throws a wrench into the works and mentions how this was actually known from industry, namely the yogurt culture, the dairy industry, where it was known that bacteria had yogurt cultures had these tandem short palindromic repeats in them, the SPRs of CRISPRs, and it was sort of hypothesized that they had to do with keeping viruses out of the yogurt, and so, but that was a technology, right? They were trying to make yogurt. They didn't care about the CRISPR sequences in these bacteria, but a lot of the basic knowledge came from like dairy chemistry, dairy biochemistry. So that's an example where there's an interplay between an application and basic science, and you stir it up, and then you get more application and more basic science as a result of that interplay. And there are, if you look at it even more and more closely, you find that a lot of science is based on something that was originally an application. It was known, for example, that mold on bread destroyed bacterial plaques in petri dishes, right? That was something that was discovered. Penicillin was discovered that way. Nobody knew the mechanism of a beta-lactam antibiotic. They didn't even know that penicillin had a beta-lactam unit in it, and they didn't even know what the structure of penicillin was at all when they first discovered this. So at some point, you just need to do something. You need to put something in a bottle or in a yogurt container, and then you see what happens down the line. So I think this linear model of science is really kind of idealized. It doesn't really happen that way. And if you look at the other examples, these are closer to what Isaacson has written about before, the invention of silicon transistors. Of course, it's very closely tied to the development of quantum mechanics. But really, if you look at the first silicon devices, you got a lot of the physics out of like having actually done the experiment, and then you use basic science to study the device that you built. And this happens over and over and over in computer science, in robotics. And one would argue that a lot of social science and economics and psychology is based on stuff that started as an application. So you build something first and then you study how it works. You build the internet first and then you study how it changes people's brains. You build Bitcoin and then you understand you build cryptocurrencies in general, and you try to understand how the economics of them work. So it's not a clean delineation from one side to the other. Okay, so there is another big theme in the book is the role of competition in science. So of course, Jennifer Doudna was in competition with Fang Zhang from the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT. They both have claim to certain parts of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing system, and there's a lot of I'm not going to get into the debate here because I'm not well enough informed about it beyond what's already in Isaacson's book. And he chose to focus it around Jennifer Doudna, and okay, so we'll leave it at that. But what about the role of competition? So competition in science is related to the larger area of the philosophy of science. So how does science actually work? And Richard Feynman, who was a Nobel Prize winning physicist at Caltech, said that something like scientists need the philosophy of science as much as birds need ornithology. And that's kind of funny. But it is worth, I think, if we're going to be professional scientists, to kind of step back and examine how we do our business, even though we kind of do it automatically. Like, are we really using that, that flow chart from the fifth grade that I mentioned earlier? So in the book, Tom Cech and Jack Szostak were characterized by Isaacson as having that sense of competition and collegiality that defines science. It certainly seems, based on published interviews that I've seen them give, that's probably true. Then there's the idea of, is competition, is it part of, should it be on that fifth grade chart? Like, should the sense of competition be in the chart? So if you look back at the history of the philosophy of science, there are a couple of big names. There's Karl Popper, who emphasized the notion of falsification. So you have a lot of different theories, you have a lot of different potential mechanisms that could explain an observed phenomenon, and then you do experiments that are well controlled, and you one by one you exclude or falsify these competing hypotheses until you hone the right one. And then you had Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in the mid 20th century, which sort of took the opposite kind of tack, which said that what we're really doing is we're changing paradigms by really supporting hypotheses as opposed to falsifying false hypotheses. We're like buttressing ones that are new and that displace the old model through these quote paradigm shifts that he talked about. Very recently, a couple of years ago, there was this book by Michael Strevens, a British philosopher of science, who wrote the book The Knowledge Machine. And what Strevens argued is that science is not completely objective, and came up with this iron rule of explanation, which I'll read here, I'll paraphrase. So if scientists are to participate in the scientific enterprise, they must uncover or generate new evidence to argue with and conduct all disputes with reference to empirical evidence alone. The key to science's success is that it channels hope, anger, envy, ambition, resentment, all the fires fuming in the human heart to one end, the production of empirical evidence. So in Strevens' kind of third way here, he's actually importing elements of human nature into the scientific method, which kind of blows your mind, because you think of science as being super analytical and a quest toward perfection of explanation and clean results and truth and objectivity. But what he's saying is that humans use their drive, their hope, anger, envy, ambition, sense of competition with others in order to generate empirical evidence that they can use to argue, that's his word, argue and conduct all disputes with reference to this empirical evidence. Now, what I have found, and I guess, okay, how does it apply to Jennifer Doudna? Were Doudna and Zhang, did they produce better results as a result of competition? Maybe it did. Maybe they did. I think there's another quote from Edward O. Wilson, who said that in his career he was blessed by having brilliant enemies. And I don't know if Doudna and Zhang consider themselves enemies. Probably overdoing it, but one can sort of see how this might apply to them. That maybe CRISPR-Cas9 technology was accelerated as a result of competition. Interestingly, is competition desirable? I have tried to spend the last 10 years of my academic career trying to avoid competing directly with other research groups in the areas in which I work. And the reason is, if you are in a big field, Jennifer Doudna says in the book that it's less risky because you're in a field that everyone knows what the boundary conditions are in the field, and also there will be people there to cite your work. And there will be people who know how to review it too for papers and grant applications. I would challenge that a little bit, because if you are doing something where there are no competitors and you're smart about it, you can actually have more freedom to operate. You can have a monopoly on that field for a given time, and as long as you can convince people that it's interesting, it is actually much easier to get grants and papers. Whereas there's a lot of risk for being in an established field because you either have to do it really, really well, you have to do it like the best. Well, there's no other. If you don't do it really well, you're not going to get funding and you're not going to get papers. if you're doing something that nobody else is doing, and this is something that my PhD advisor, George Whitesides, used to say, if you're doing something that nobody else is doing, then he said, one, you don't have to do it very well, haha, and two, you don't have to read the literature, haha. So, it's a joke, but you can kind of see where it's going. I would argue, however, that by creating this, by being one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, that Professor Doudna is actually having it both ways in a good way. So she was able to monopolize this field almost, not quite. There's the issue of Funk Jung, but also be close enough to people like Shostak, Czech, George Church, and so on, who were in adjacent areas that could support this kind of RNA-based technology, because there is the background intellectual milieu in which she could work and have people understand the significance of it, even though not many other people were doing exactly that. All right, with that, thank you very much for your attention. I would highly recommend this book as an accurate portrayal of the way that academic scientific research is done. I think Walter Isaacson got it 98% right. I think it's pretty unusual that words like grants and grad students and postdocs and working in the lab and how people actually do experiments actually makes it into a book as wildly successful as this is, and by an author as well regarded as Walter Isaacson. If I had to change anything, the first thing I would do is put Jennifer Doudna's name toward the top and not in the subtitle. Why did Benjamin Franklin and Steve Jobs and Leonardo da Vinci get to be in the main title and not the subtitle? I don't know. Jennifer Doudna is not as famous yet. Maybe he'll rethink it in a future edition. All right. Take care. Hope you enjoyed this or found it interesting.